Hello, hello everybody. Now again, we have come with the last section of this chapter, that is the concept related to deficient demand and deflation. In the last video, we discussed about excess demand and inflationary gap. Now it is deficient demand and deflationary gap. And what my experience is that if we understand only one, either you remember inflationary gap, excess demand, deflationary gap, deficient demand, then the other one is automatic. Any one you remember and understand, the other one is automatic, because just opposite. Now, how to define inflationary gap? Excess demand. Now, in this situation, if the aggregate demand, how we define excess demand? Now, if the aggregate demand falls short, if the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level of output, this is a situation of excess demand. If the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level of output, then the situation is excess demand. Now, you just reverse here. If the aggregate demand falls short of the aggregate supply, or if the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level of output, then this is a situation of deficient demand. Simple thing. Either only one you remember, the other one is automatic. Once again, I repeat, when you have excess demand, how to define? If the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level of output, this is excess demand. Now come to deficient demand. If the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level of output, then this is a situation of deficient demand. I hope the concept is clear. If the aggregate demand falls short of aggregate supply, or the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level of output, then the situation is deficient demand. And the extent to which the aggregate demand falls short of the aggregate supply is called deflationary gap. The extent to which the aggregate demand falls short or less than the aggregate supply, this is called deflationary gap. Why it is called deflationary gap? Because it creates the situation of deflation or recession. That's why it is called deflationary gap. Just opposite of inflation. It is deflationary gap. In inflation, the prices rise. In deflation, the prices fall. Inflation is a situation of full employment, but during deflation, the unemployment increases. So that's why it is called deflationary gap. So once again I repeat, if the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level of output, then it is a situation of deficient demand. Then I add the extent to which the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply is otherwise called deflationary gap. And why it is called deflationary gap? Because it leads to the situation of deflation in the economy. That's why it is called a deflationary gap, which we can explain with the help of a diagram. O-axis, O-y-axis, O-x-axis measures same thing, income and output, employment, and here we have aggregate demand. Then this is the 45-degree line. The 45-degree line, so that is the aggregate supply curve. that is aggregate supply, which is equal to C plus S. Right. Suppose OI is the full employment output, and to attain equilibrium at this level of output, we require aggregate demand equal to EY. The required aggregate demand is EY because we have assumed that the full employment output is OY, and to have equilibrium at this level of output, the required aggregate demand is EY, and the aggregate demand curve should be AD. But actually, due to decrease in investment, due to some reason or other, there is a decrease in investment in the economy. As the investment, the economy decrease, so aggregate demand take a left turn, so it decreases. So the actual aggregate demand is something less than the required aggregate demand due to fall in the investment. So the actual aggregate demand is AD1, which is C plus I minus delta I, because the investment has decreased. And this is the actual aggregate demand. And at the full employment level, we see the aggregate demand falls short of the required aggregate demand by EK. You require to attain full employment equilibrium, the required aggregate demand is UI. But when the actual aggregate demand curve is drawn, the actual aggregate demand is KY. So the actual aggregate demand falls short of the required aggregate demand by the amount EK. And this EK is otherwise known as inflationary gap. This is called inflationary gap. Yes, I'm sorry, this is called deflationary gap. This is deflationary gap. This gap is deflationary gap because the actual aggregate demand falls short of the required aggregate demand. The required aggregate demand is EY and the actual aggregate demand is KY, and the shortage is EK, and that is deflationary gap. And if you see the actual with the actual aggregate demand, the equilibrium takes place at point F, and this is called the less than full employment equilibrium, or we can say this is underemployment equilibrium. Suppose the income is OT before full employment output. Full employment output is OY. Before the full employment output, the equilibrium is taking place, and the actual equilibrium output is OT, and the equilibrium point is F. So point F is less than full employment equilibrium. Full employment equilibrium is E. Full employment equilibrium point is E, but the actual equilibrium point is F. That is less than full employment equilibrium, or we can say it is underemployment equilibrium. So this is deflationary gap. This gap EK is deflationary gap. This EK, the gap EK is deflationary gap. Coming to the reasons of why this deficient demand takes place, and the reasons are just opposite. If there is a sudden decrease in propensity to consume, marginal propensity to consume, if the marginal propensity to consume decreases, then consumption expenditure decreases, aggregate demand decreases, then deficient demand. Increase in taxes. Suppose in the budget, the government increase the taxes. If the rate of the existing tax increases or some new taxes imposed, then the disposable income of the people will decline. As the disposable income decreases, consumption expenditure decreases, and thereby deficient demand. Decrease in government expenditure. If the government reduces the expenditure, if government expenditure reduced, then also the income level, disposable income level of the people decreases, your consumption expenditure decreases, and thereby the situation of deficient demand. In this COVID situation, also we have a situation of recession because there is a shortage of income. Because of the closure of industries, this closure of business units, because of shutdown, lockdown, there is a shortage of income. Because there is a shortage of income, many people have lost their employment and earning sources. That's why there is a shortage of income. So the consumption expenditure has decreased, the aggregate demand has decreased, and the business organizations find there is a recession in the economy. And this is a situation of deficient demand and deflationary gap. Abhi COVID situation, now the situation COVID-19 is also creates a situation of deflationary gap, recession, because now the demand is less. And coming to the effect of deflationary gap, it is the opposite of inflationary gap. I told you during the period of excess demand or inflationary gap, the producers, the businessmen, they are gainers and the consumers are loser. And coming to a deflationary gap, the businessmen, the producer, they are the loser because the profit margin decreases, and the consumers are gainer because they get the goods at a lower price. The consumers are gainer. Going to employment and all, employment and output, I told you that in case of inflationary gap or in a situation of excess demand, there is no impact on employment output because this is a phenomena of full employment. But coming to deflationary gap, if deflation happens, this in deflationary gap takes place, then the output will decrease, employment will decrease, unemployment will increase, national income will decrease. That's why there is some question comes. If somebody asks this question, which is better, inflation or deflation? This is very genuine question. If a question asks, which is better, inflation or deflation? Certainly the answer will be both are evils. Inflation is an evil and deflation is an evil. Both are evils. But inflation is less of the two evils. लेकिन inflation थोड़ा कम evil है क्योंकि inflation redistributes national income in favor of rich and against the poor. So it makes rich richer and poor poorer, but does not decrease the national income. When there is an inflationary gap is injustice. There is injustice or it is unjust because it redistributes national income in favor of the rich. It makes the rich richer and it goes against the poor and makes poor poorer, but it does not decrease the national income. But deflation pauperizes the whole society. It reduces the national income. During deflationary gap, the national income decreases, unemployment increases. So if you compare with inflationary gap and deflationary gap, then inflationary is less of the two evils. This much for this deficient demand deflationary gap. Thank you. If you like my teaching, if you like this video, please do not forget to subscribe so that in future I go for other topics. Thank you. And I'll try to see in next videos, I'll try to explain some of the numerical problems related to working of multiplier, related to finding the equilibrium level of income, that I'm trying to prepare some video on how to solve the numerical problems related to this chapter. Thank you very much.